Iran has agreed to hand over their enriched uranium to the U.S. Joining me now to discuss the latest development is Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer. He's a retired Marine intelligence officer. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So Iran has now agreed to hand over their enriched uranium to the U.S., according to the president. And this, of course, is after their military infrastructure is badly damaged so that they can't quickly pick up where they left off from developing potentially a nuclear weapon. Talk about what this means for national security as well as for global safety.
Iris, of course, if we could get all the enriched uranium out of Iran, that would basically block them from developing a nuclear weapon. That's the downstream. Of course, they have to increase that 60% enriched uranium up to 90%, which is not a difficult task to do. They also have a lot of uranium is at 20%. That's something that has to be looked at as well, because that could potentially be enriched up to 60% or more. But right now, the issue is the president has said that we have an agreement that we're going to go in there and get what he calls the radioactive or uranium dust, kind of referring to the Midnight Hammer attack last June. But it's the radioactive material that's buried underground. The Iranians have been kind of going back and forth today, and I think that's really a depiction of their government. You got a more moderate side, and you got the hardcore side. They came back and said, well, there really is no agreement on the uranium. We're not quite sure how we're going to do that. So I think there's a lot more to be worked out. That'll probably be part of the final agreement, but I think there's a lot of steps that have to be done to get everybody on board with what's necessary to get that uranium out of Iran.
Well, definitely a process that's remaining to be seen how it's going to play out. Meanwhile, here's a clip from the president just tonight talking about the progress with Iran. Let's take a look.
This process should go very quickly, and that most of the points are already negotiated and agreed to. You'll be very happy. The USA will get all nuclear dust, And somebody said, how are we going to get the nuclear dust? We're going to get it by going in with Iran, with lots of excavators, because...
So, Hal, what might that process of working with Iran to extract the nuclear dust, as the president calls it, looks like? And of course, as we just talked about it, Iran has been going back and forth on several occasions. Is that regime trustworthy?
Well, I don't know if the regime is trustworthy, but we might get an agreement to do that. But what it would take is a rather extensive presence in Iran at certain select sites where the radioactive material is stored. Obviously, you'd have to go in there. I used to be the director of intelligence of a multinational group that dealt with weapons of mass destruction, or to include nuclear consequence management. So when you go in there, you're going to have a lot of things dealing with, obviously, force protection, but also dealing with the radioactivity itself. The dust, if you want to call it, that term is actually kind of accurate. You have to have a lot of protective gear, what we call PPE, personal protective equipment, that's necessary for being underground, to be in that environment, to protect those who are working it. And it's not going to be something that happens fast. It could probably take not weeks, but maybe months, maybe even longer to get it out of there. So there's a lot of work that has to be done, and there has to be a lot of agreement with Iran in order to make this happen.
Well, indeed, a very complicated process, and thank you for your expertise on that matter. Meanwhile, on another subject here, President Trump says we actually have a good relationship with Iran, saying that the blockade is maybe more powerful than the bombing. Is it the economic pressure, you think, from the U.S. Navy blockade on Iranian ports that's ultimately now pushing Iran to agree to U.S. terms potentially?
Iris, absolutely. That is exactly what it is. Iran is probably within about 3 to 4 weeks of what some would call an economic collapse. Right now, their economy has seen massive inflation. I think it's over 40%, probably higher. The currency is devaluing precipitously. Economic activity is slowing down. It's not just the fact they're not able to export oil, which is their primary source of overseas revenue, but it's also a lot of things they need that they have to import. All of this has been blocked, which means that Iran economically can't keep sustaining itself. The regime economically can't keep sustaining itself. And they also recognize what caused the protesters to go to the streets in December and January. It was the fundamental frustration of the population with how the economy was falling apart. This will be even more serious if it came to fruition in a few weeks. So they have a clock ticking. They know they have to do something, and I think that this is a the blockade is working very well at forcing them into this very uncomfortable position they don't want to do, which is to make concessions.
And Hal, in addition to, of course, this blockade really squeezing the Iranian regime itself, we know that the president now saying that the strait will now be open without further obstruction from Iran. They got a promise that they won't try to block it further. So about that, do you think it's going to have a wider impact on the whole region or even the world, as Iran can now no longer hold the hostage, hold this hostage?
Well, what they say means probably very little in terms of their intent. What it means is our ability to keep it open. Now, the Europeans and other countries are looking at coming in and setting up some sort of what they call defensive presence that will keep the strait open. Already today, a large cruise ship actually sailed from the Persian Gulf up and over and out into the Indian Ocean. It took a passage that brought it very close to the countries of Oman and UAE, kind of hugging that southern part of the strait. And now the Iranians are saying that all ships have to go up through this route that goes up through a couple of Iranian islands up north. That's where they had that crypto coin toll booth situation set up. They're still advocating that, but that's not something we've agreed to. And if the strait is open, which it may be largely safe to go through some of the major passages there. They're just trying to verify that there are no mines and stuff. Then they go through. But regardless of what the president says, regardless of what the Iranians say, really what matters is kind of what Lloyd's of London says. If Lloyd's of London decides the risk is acceptable and they drop the cost of maritime insurance for going through the strait, that's where you're going to see a lot of ships going back and forth.
Well, definitely all eyes on the ships in the coming hours and days. Meanwhile, Vice President J.D. Vance saying that the president is offering Iran more than just peace. Take a look.
He said, if you guys commit to not having a nuclear weapon, we are going to make Iran thrive. We're going to make it economically prosperous, and we're going to invite the Iranian people into the world economy in a way they haven't been in my entire life. And that's the kind of Trumpian grand bargain that the president has put on the table.
Do you think a prosperous future is in store for Iran if it does actually agree to give up its nuclear ambitions and, of course, now start to work with the U.S. in getting rid of their nuclear dust and remaining materials? What could a future and a deal like that entail?
Well, it's interesting. I listened to the vice president when he's talking about that. He says his entire life. He is a little bit younger vice president in that regard, but he's absolutely correct in that if the deal he's talking about probably entails much more of a regime change than we have now. If this theocratic, autocratic, extreme, death to America, America's a great Satan, regime continues, even if they don't have a nuclear weapon, I don't think that's going to happen. But if the regime does change, if they actually have elections, if a pro-Western regime was to come in, that's something that's been said all along, is that the U.S. and probably a lot of other countries in the world, Europe, Asia, elsewhere, would help that Iran, and that Iran could basically lift itself out of the sanctions, imposed prison that it's been in for quite some time, rejoin the international economy, kind of like what Iran was before 1979, and they could be a major player. And certainly if they were able to, uncork, if you will, the entrepreneurial capabilities of the Iranians and all the it is a very sophisticated, very smart, capable population. They have just been basically suppressed by this regime. If they can end that, I think you could see a very prosperous Iran being a major player in the global stage.
Iran before 1979, a long road ahead, of course, but on the other front, we are seeing some optimistic breakthroughs with Lebanon as well as Israel. President Trump saying that the U.S. is still working with Israel and Lebanon. Here's what he said. Watch.
Yeah, it's very exciting. With Lebanon, it's very exciting. I think we're going to have a deal. We're going to have a meeting, first time in 44 years. And Lebanon will be meeting with Israel, and they're probably going to do it at the White House.
When do you think, President, when do you think they would?
Over the next week or two.
How will the damage to the Iranian regime, as we're seeing right now, handicap Hezbollah and other terrorist groups that is really sponsoring in the region? And is that a reason to be optimizing for these talks with Lebanon?
Well, I think so. Now, one thing we have done, you may have recalled that the Pakistani prime minister, when he helped broker this thing to begin with, had said that the Lebanese ceasefire was connected to the Iranian ceasefire. Of course, Iran said that there had to be a ceasefire in Lebanon before there was a ceasefire, and they turned around and of course, they kept the strait closed with that. But we have always claimed, the U.S. and of course Israel have always claimed that the Lebanese ceasefire is not connected to the ceasefire with Iran. Although when the Lebanese ceasefire was put in place, Iran cited that and said, "Okay, we're opening the strait," and they did it right away. So obviously, in their minds, they're trying to connect those two things. The Lebanese ceasefire, though, is it's going to be challenging. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that the government of Lebanon and Israel actually have the same goals. They want to demilitarize and disarm Hezbollah and stop the threat that Hezbollah poses to the region. That is a big shift that's taken place over the last several months, to bring them together. Lebanon is kind of the guarantor that Hezbollah will not fire on Israeli forces, but Hezbollah is saying, hey, the Israeli forces should be leaving Lebanese territory, and Israel said they're not leaving Lebanese territory. In other words, there's a lot of chances for the ceasefire to potentially break down. But with that, I think there's a lot of hope that it'll stay in place and that something's going to get basically worked out in that regard. Lebanese government military forces are relatively weak and have not been able to really do a lot with the Hezbollah forces. That may be shifting if they're teamed up with Israel, but we'll have to see what they can actually engage with diplomatically in that regard.
Well, certainly it will be a huge breakthrough for lasting peace if the ceasefire can actually stay in place. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us tonight. Really appreciate it.